Hey everybody, my name is Marcus Cole with the West Virginia Soccer Association, and we're presenting another WVSA Digital Network Series webinar. Today we have Conor Harris, Certified Strength and Conditioning Coach, and today he's going to be talking about rethinking your core training as a soccer player. Now, of course, before we begin, we certainly want to remind you that before beginning any exercise program, certainly consult your family physician or doctor, and make sure you're doing things under supervised proper supervision. So let's welcome to the show. First time on the webinar. However, he's been on our podcast before, and we're excited to have him. Great follow on social media. Conor Harris, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Marcus. I'm excited to be here, and this is a subject I'm very passionate about, and I think people will get a lot of value out of this. Going to try and make it simple and easy to understand, and we're going to roll through just some anatomy at first, and we're going to get into some conceptual stuff, and then we're going to end with practical programs and exercises, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So with that being said, we're going to rethink core training today, and we're going to kind of put to rest a few of the myths that are out there, and we're going to talk about what we should be thinking about when it comes to core training. This is very principles based because we can do crunches, we can do sit-ups, we can do all these traditional things, but at the end of the day, we're worried about performance. And if we want to be the best athletes possible, then I think we need to think about some other things as it relates to the core. So just quick background on me. My name is Conor Harris. Obviously, I have worked in a variety of different settings. I've worked with 21st round picks across the three major sports in the United States. I began a high school strength conditioning program that I got up and running in about 2 years there in North Carolina. And I've also been a strength coach for the 2018 College World Series baseball team. So I've worked with really just about every population under the sun. And a big part of my high school strength conditioning program was working with varsity soccer athletes. So that was, I would say it was a good third of the athletes I trained. Our soccer program over there was pretty good and pretty well known within North Carolina. So also, I am a certified strength and conditioning specialist, CSCS, personal trainer, corrective exercise specialist, and also performance specialist. So that being said, let's dig into some anatomy because I think this is essential to understand. Even if you don't care about muscles, even if you don't if you're going to forget this, then I just want to go through and help you understand why positioning of muscles is key. Because if you don't understand what the general muscles do here, it's going to be hard for you to understand why select certain exercises down the road. So with that being said, in your anterior core, the front of your trunk, you have really three primary muscle groups that make up what traditionally people think of as the core. You have your rectus abdominis. These are your six-pack abs. You have internal and external obliques. These are your side abs. And then you have these deep transverse abdominis abs. Now, the six-pack is great. It looks great. Everyone wants one. But in terms of functional performance, making better soccer players, this doesn't really do as much as the other two muscle groups. Is going to be a muscle that flexes your trunk, so brings you together in a crunch. But essentially, it's more of a stabilizer muscle than anything else. Now, when it comes to the obliques, these are the muscles I'm really concerned about when it comes to training the core, because these muscles help create resist motion, but most of all, they control the orientation of our overall anterior posture within our body. And they also are exhalation muscles. I'm going to get deep into breathing today because I think that needs to be a primary focus of much of what we think of when it comes to core training. The transverse abdominis are going to help regulate pressure within our core. They're also exhalation muscles. They're going to make sure our trunk is stabilized in a very efficient manner. Now let's talk about the posterior core. So right behind those muscles on the other side of our body, we have our rectus spinae, lumbar extensors. These are the muscles that arch our backs. We have our quadratus lumborum, which are these muscles on the side right here, which laterally flexes, side bends us from side to side, and also extends our spine. And then we have this smaller muscle called the multifidus, which is very important for stabilizing our trunk within extension and also helps assist us within other smaller movements. So essentially the muscles in the front are going to have us come forward. And the muscles in the back, they're going to arch our backs. And ultimately what we're seeking is stability throughout both of these anterior and posterior chambers of our body. Now, we're going to get into the diaphragm here, because your diaphragm, in my opinion, is probably the most important trunk muscle. Now, breathing is directly correlated with the diaphragm. When we inhale, the diaphragm descends and our rib cage expands, or it should. And then when we eccentrically relax the diaphragm, when we exhale, it descends back up and everything sort of comes together. This is very important because in order for us to have proper balance throughout our posterior and anterior trunk and also our entire body, this muscle needs to be functioning. It needs to be able to expand and contract. It needs to be able to ascend and descend. So this is a very important concept called the zone of apposition. Now, the zone of apposition, this can look confusing to you at first, but essentially what it's saying is that we need to be able to keep our rib cage down when we inhale. If we are constantly inhaled, if we're biasing our bodies towards inhalation, then our rib cage is going to be overinflated. Our diaphragm is going to be descended, and it's going to be unable to function as a proper core muscle. It's going to be able to be a stabilizer, but we don't want this muscle to be a stabilizer. We want this muscle to function in respiration. And if we're talking about being proficient aerobically, having endurance, we want that diaphragm to work. So this suboptimal zone of apposition, I want you to notice a couple of things here. Notice how much forward this individual's head is. Notice how expanded this rib cage is. So this can bias us into a certain position that is not very conducive for optimal performance. Whereas here, we have a good ability to expand our rib cage and have the rib cage come back when we exhale. Everything is stacked nicely here. Our center of mass is nice and even over our midfoot, whereas here, you can see there's more things pushing us forward onto our toes. So the takeaway for this slide would just be, we want the rib cage to be able to expand and contract, and we don't want to be overly inflated because our diaphragm cannot work. Now, the body is inherently lazy. It doesn't care how it gets a job done. It just wants to get the job done in the most efficient manner possible, meaning we want to expend the least amount of calories for the most amount of results. If you think about back when we were hunters and gatherers on the plains, we didn't know where our next meal was coming from necessarily. We didn't know if we were going to be able to eat that day or night. We had to conserve energy. We became very efficient because of that. We always were seeking a way to be as metabolically efficient as we possibly could. So with that in mind, it's important to know that we haven't lived in this contemporary society where we've been sitting all day, where we're in classrooms and we're constantly sitting, and we're in this relatively stationary environment for a long period of time. And up until a couple 100 years ago or so, we really haven't been doing that very much. We were constantly on our feet, moving in 3 planes of motion, just like soccer players do. We are still hardwired for survival. We still have this hardwiring within our body of spending the least amount of calories, the least amount of energy for the most amount of results. Now, that being said, air is going to follow the path of least resistance. And if you're confused, why is he talking about breathing so much? Well, just bear with me, because this is going to matter a lot. Humans are biased naturally towards inhalation. That's just how we tend to go. When we inhale, we take in more air relative to how much we exhale every single time, unless we're actively forcing more air out. And no matter what, unless you're really trying hard to exhale, you are going to have a degree of air in your lungs. So you're always inflated to a degree. But if we can't exhale properly, then we're going to be stuck in this even more excessively hyperinflated state. And then hyperinflation is going to lead to potentially excessive extension within our bodies. When I say extension, I mean an anterior pelvic tilt. Think about an arched back. You see this all the time. Athletes spend so much time on their toes. They're constantly going forward. That's really the goal of most of athletics, is find a way to get forward and have the other people not stop you from going forward. If you want to make it that simple, you can. So we always talk about individuality within bodies and how everyone's different, and that's absolutely true. But at the end of the day, we're still human beings, We still have our limbs in a certain orientation. Our organs are oriented in a certain way within our body. And we're all trying to do two primary things: survive and go forward. That is locomotion. That is walking. That is running. That is soccer. We're trying to get the ball down the field. We're going forward. So because of this, it's actually pretty predictable a lot of the times how people tend to compensate, how they tend to default into extension. It's just the way we get there and how we start off based on our individual morphology is going to vary. But that being said, we still tend to get biased towards this anterior pelvic tilt orientation. Now, that matters because length tension relationships are going to be altered if we're biased into one state. Every single muscle should have a degree of resting slack. Imagine a rope, and this rope should be able to, if you kind of bring it in and out, it's going to have a little bit of slack. Every muscle has a little bit of slack. If a muscle is too long, then that slack is taken out, and then it's going to have to overcome its orientation of being too long, eccentric orientation. If a muscle is too short, then it's going to have to work even harder to fire because it doesn't have the ability to go through that slack and contract. It's already starting from a shortened position, so power output is going to be limited. Now, if you look at this picture here on the right, this anterior tilted orientation, you're going to see that a muscle on one side is going to affect the muscle on the other side. If we have a compressed and tight low back, then our abs are going to be long, taut, and weakened out. They're going to be in that too long of orientation. If our pelvis is forward in this orientation, our quads are going to be excessively tight. They're going to be excessively short. And then we're going to have lengthened out hamstrings. So if your athletes feel like their hamstrings are tight, well, I've got some news for you guys. It's not always the fact that they're short and they need to be stretched. If we stretch these hamstrings, we're just stretching a muscle that's being pulled on from both ends already. That's what hamstring tightness is in the vast majority of athletes, unless there is some sort of major compensation, trauma to the tissues, or just overall just highly compensatory activity within the body. So this is what I see time and time again, especially within high school and early college athletes. So why does this matter? Let's summarize what we just kind of went through right there. So poor breathing is going to lead to compromised length tension relationships throughout the body as we become biased towards inhalation. So we breathe 20,000 times a day. Imagine that you do 20,000 reps of pushing yourself forward with air every single time. Now, if you look at this picture here, when we inhale, because we can't get air into our rib cage because our diaphragm isn't working because it's descended, where's air going to go? Air is going to go into our belly. It's going to be this belly breathing sort of strategy, which is pushing us forward more and more with every single breath. So we become accustomed to this because air is just following the path of least resistance. Our rib cage is compressed, so we're going to have to find a way to push air out or get air in somehow, and that's going to be through our belly. Chronic extension is the resultant outcome of poor respiratory function. Again, people are different, but we're not that different. How we start varies, but how we get there varies slightly, but we end up in generally the same sort of orientation. Our quads, our low back is going to take over for a lack of hamstring and abdominal function. Now, think about how so many athletes, so many soccer players, like a lot of people have big, meaty quads relative to the size of their hamstrings. You see this very, very rarely will you see someone with bigger hamstrings than quads. That doesn't happen very often. It's for this specific reason. Now, if you can imagine this picture right here, look at the compression that could be happening within the knee right here. Look at how this forward orientation of the pelvis could put us forward on our toes, and then our patellas are compressed. That hamstring isn't able to stabilize that knee. Our low back could be compressed because there's so much extension going on within it. Now, what's missing in most athletes is this zone of apposition, the ability to keep the rib cage down while inhaling, which is allowing the diaphragm to descend and ascend. It can't ascend if there's no room in the rib cage for it to do it, if we're constantly arching our low backs and living in this posture. So our obliques are so essential for exhalation and pelvic control. You can see that if your obliques were to turn on, they attach at the bottom of your rib cage here, and also right about here on the front of your pelvis. If they were to turn on, you could help restore this orientation that we're stuck in. Hamstrings, for the same exact reason of obliques. Posterior pelvic tilting, that's bringing the pelvis from an anterior tilt to a posterior tilt. A more neutral center of mass. If we're on our toes, then we probably want to bring some neutrality back to our pelvis so that we can feel our heels. And posterior and potentially anterior rib cage expansion. Now, it's going to vary depending on the individual, but you guys could see that if we were tight in our rib cage here and we have rounded over up here, it's going to be hard for things to properly expand back here. That's not to say we want a completely straight back, but we want something like this where things can evenly come out and in together as one functioning unit. So let's talk about functional core training. Now, functional is entirely context dependent, but this is kind of a buzzword that you see a lot of the times. But I'm using this in the context of soccer performance in terms of developing good athletes. So breathing is the number one function of the core, like plain and simple. That's what it's for. If we don't breathe, there's a lot of science that says you die if you can't breathe. So also you need to be able to create and resist motion within our core. A lot of people think that the core is just a stabilizing part of our body. Well, our obliques actually rotate our core, or rotate our trunk from side to side every time we take a step forward, or at least they should. So we need to both create and resist motion at optimal periods, at the time when it needs to happen. So I want to take you guys through a quick practical right here of how good breathing really feels. And you guys will be surprised at how hard this is for a lot of us. So what I want you to do is sit or stand tall. If you're sitting, just sit upright with your back off your rest. Now take your hands, link them together like this, and place them on your lower rib cage, right about here, where your lowest ribs are. Now, I want you to exhale through your mouth, keeping your belly relaxed until you feel both obliques turn on. If you do something like this, you're not going to really feel it. The obliques need to they are activated through forced respiration like this. Exhale till you feel your obliques turn on. Now, hold that compression and then pause for 3 seconds. And then inhale through your nose and see if you can keep your ribs down. I guarantee you're going to want to flare that rib cage up, and you're going to feel tight up here when you inhale. That's because the rib cage is compressed. You're going to want to elevate your shoulders. It's going to feel restricted, like you can't inhale very well. Well, that's because we can't expand our rib cages a lot of the time. So let's go through 2 full breaths right now. Hands on the ribs, nice and tall, heels flat on the floor. Inhale through our nose, exhale through our mouth. Pause. Inhale, keeping the ribs down. Exhale again. Feel the obliques. Pause. Now keep those obliques on, keep those ribs down. Inhale. You should feel like your back is expanding. You should feel like your chest is expanding. If it's not, that's an indication that you probably can't breathe very well. And this is not only in athletes, guys. This is in so many people I work with. The number one thing I look at when I work with someone for the first time is breathing. So with that being said, I want to get into a couple of examples of exercises. So when we're thinking about core training, I don't care about crunches. I don't care about sit-ups. I don't care about butterfly kicks, because that's all rectus six-pack abs. And I don't really want to go after those all the time. If you want to have great abs, great, be my guest. But if we want performance, we want the obliques to work, to restore the center of mass, to be able to get ribcage expansion, to prevent those hamstrings from getting too elongated and taut, to take pressure off of our knees potentially. There's a myriad of different things that can happen, but ultimately we want to restore the ability to be able to find our heels again, because soccer players spend so much time on our toes. So if we're always on our toes, we're just promoting this idea of constant extension. So this is a really good activity to do. Now, what I'm doing is I'm feeling my heels dig into this roller right here. You don't have to use a roller. You can just use anything that's elevated. And I'm going to reach towards the ceiling without my sternum dropping, like slouching. And then I'm going to go through that same exact breathing sequence. Inhale through my nose, exhale through my mouth, keep the compression. And then I'm going to just keep doing that for about 4 to 5 breaths. Now, this is brutal if you do it right. this is a really great exercise. If you guys want to play around with this, I would encourage you, have your athletes squat, do this exercise, make sure it's done correctly, and then have them squat again, and then see what happens. You'll see that they will be less biased towards falling onto their toes. They'll be less biased towards extending their low backs, and they'll be able to keep a more neutral spine. Example number 2, all 4 breathing. These exercises look so simple, but guys, they are not. They will burn you if you go long enough with them and you do them correctly. So this here is going after that posterior rib cage expansion, which so many people lack. I'm feeling my heels on the wall for hamstring reference. I'm using this band as a reference to push and retract my rib cage, push my rib cage back, but ultimately you really don't need to do that. In fact, you don't even need this wall reference right away. If this is too hard, just put their knees underneath their hips and just be in this quadruped all fours position. Now, all I'm doing here is I'm doing that same exact breathing sequence. Notice how I'm not arching my back a ton, or sorry, rounding my back a ton. I'm not going for a ton of flexion. I'm not trying to slouch over. I'm just trying to push the floor away a little bit to get my rib cage back. And then I'm just going through that whole breathing sequence, making sure that I'm not arching my back, not letting my back collapse as I inhale again or exhale, because that's what people are going to want to do. I would also say that this is a very good exercise to do after a training session, to do in a warm-up even, because this is what's going to help orient them into a better position for potentially the soccer game, for potentially a training session in the weight room. Let's move on to the next one. So this looks like a bench press on the ground, but it's not. This is one of the most brutal oblique exercises you can do. So what I'm going for here is I'm alternating one at a time. You'll see that I'm digging down slightly to get my hips tucked underneath me for that posterior tilt, getting out of extension. I'm pausing at the top. Look at me shake because this is hard. I'm exhaling at the top, inhaling at the top. I'm coming down, I'm pressing the other dumbbell up, reaching, feeling that same side oblique. And then as I inhale, I'm feeling my upper rib cage expand, my other side of my chest expand, and also potentially my back rib cage on the other side. You see how when my arm goes up here, this exposes this area right here to expand? That's exactly what we want to do, because guys, all we're doing is facilitating expansion of air. This is all just pressure management. This is all just air being redirected. And if you guys also, if you guys want to have better respiratory function as it relates to bringing in more oxygen so you can last longer in the game, let's get ourselves breathing right. Because if we're not inhaling enough, if our respiratory function is poor, then we're not going to be able to take in enough oxygen to feed to our tissues. Therefore, we're going to be fatigued quicker. So that's another reason why this stuff matters so much. So that's essentially what I'm doing here, just going through that same breathing sequence. And the hamstring facilitation here is a really easy way to make sure that my body is stacked, my rib cage is stacked over my pelvis. So really, anytime you can get some sort of heel reference, I think it's a great thing to do, because you're giving athletes what they don't have, which is the ability to sense their heels. When it comes down to soccer game time, yeah, I want them on their toes. I want them on their forefoot. I want them to be able to be quick and reactive. But ultimately, if we can't get back onto our heels, then we're going to be stuck in one biased postural orientation, which will ultimately put us back into that anterior pelvic tilt. And if we can't get out of that, then we're going to be lacking movement variability. Now, this is a side plank with a banded reach. This is a very good, simple activity where I'm just lifting my leg up to get some frontal plane hip abduction activity, working those hip muscles that tend to be generally weak, coming up and down. You don't even have to have the leg lift necessarily, but I think this is a very good exercise, because as I'm reaching, I'm getting some, this is a little bonus, you're getting a little serratus anterior, which is a great muscle for shoulder health. And while I reach, I'm closing off my abs on the bottom, obviously, because they're working, but the reach also engages my abs on the top a little bit. So if we think about how air follows the path of least resistance, where is it going to go? It's going to go into my back. It's going to go into my rib cage. This is a great way to train the core in a stationary manner, but get all of that expansion that we're looking for. Now, finally, this is more of a dynamic exercise. This is a one-arm rotational row. Now, you can do this with a band if you don't have one of these machines. A band would be perfectly acceptable. Just lay on the floor, attach the band to something, and then get at it. So you might look at this right away and go, man, his back is rounded, but it's not. There's a difference between rib cage retraction and slouching. Now, look at what I do here. This is slouching, but this is me staying tall. I didn't lose any height in my skeleton, and I'm getting my ribs back. That's going to open up my back rib cage so I can get air into it. Now, the tricky part is keeping this position as I reach with my other hand. This is video sped up, but I'm pausing in each position. I'll just walk you through it from step one here. So I'm going to exhale at first, feel my abs turn on, keeping my ribs down. I'm going to reach with the other arm, and I'm going to bring the working arm back. So I'm working rib cage mobility. I'm getting myself to move, and then I'm going to feel those abs, and then air. Where is it going to go? You guys know the drill by now. It's going into my rib cage where I want it. And then I'm going to come back to center, and then I'm going to hold there and breathe. So there's 3 positions. I'm switching my arms, but I'm also pausing in the center. Because guys, every time we take a step, whether you're aware of it or not, one arm's coming forward, one arm's coming back. And when that happens, we're expanding certain parts of our rib cage and not so much others. So we want to be able to train ourselves to expand each side of the rib cage as we walk, run, cut, are in a soccer game, whatever the case may be. As humans, we're naturally alternating animals, moving from side to side. So we want to be able to train that. And this is a really good exercise to get that job done. Now, in terms of a warm-up, in terms of actually implementing these exercises, because you can look at them and be like, great, so what do I do with this? But this is what I would recommend. Something like the following here. I am not a big proponent of a long warm-up. I think the goal of the warm-up should be to minimize it, get them ready to go, work in all 3 planes of motion, and then kind of get after it and do what we really want to get done that day. That being said, I'm going to start on the floor. I'm going to get them up off of the floor, and I'm going to help facilitate these things I want to do. 2 sets of 5 breaths on that foam roller hamstring bridge, 2 sets of 5 breaths within that all 4 breathing. Fire hydrants for some hip mobility, thoracic rotations to make sure that I'm really opening up and I can actually rotate through my upper back and not my low back. And then we're going to go into our actual linear speed stuff here. Marches, A skips, A runs, 10-yard sprints, boom, we're good to go. If it's a game day, probably only 1 or 2 sprints. But ultimately, this is maybe a 7-minute warm-up tops, and then they can get into it, and we're not spending a ton of time doing things that potentially aren't going to give us much benefit. Now, if we're actually in the weight room, I'm assuming I have some people here who actually run the weight training for their athletes. This is a very general example of what you can do to actually program these exercises within a weight training session. So let's assume we're just doing a full body day. And we're going to start off with a front squat because if you guys, this might be a little bit more of a tangent, but if we're thinking back squat here, guys, what do you think a back squat is doing? The bar is on our back. It's at that posterior load. We're going to have to extend if we want to compensate, and the weight's too heavy. Our form's not optimal. It's very easy to cheat in a back squat and sort of push our butts out and arch our backs. A front squat, much harder to do that. You're going to maintain a rib cage over a pelvis, which is what we're looking for. And then they're going to do this exercise and then go to a cable 1-arm rotational row, the exercise we just talked about, and then all 4 breathing. And then this is going to help, all these exercises are going to help us have better front squat positioning, because on a squat, what do you want to feel? Your heels. You want to get your rib cage back. You want to actually be able to get those ribs back and stacked over your pelvis so that you're not excessively arching your back. You're using your abs, not your low back during the squat to stabilize your trunk. And then a single leg deadlift into that supine 90-90 dumbbell alternating press, 3 by 6 breaths each, and then that side plank with banded reach. If you notice, we went lower push, upper pull, abs, lower pull, upper push, abs. This is a pretty quick and easy full body day you can implement right away. So Guys, that's really all I have for you. I tried to keep it simple, straightforward, but the takeaway points are respect what's going on within the rib cage, respect what's going on with the obliques, throw out those traditional crunches, bicycle kicks, all that stuff. If we're talking about developing the best athletes possible, we want to think of things on a global level, how these things affect us in terms of optimal length tension relationships, optimal performance. If you guys are interested in learning more, I have my website right here, thepinnacleperformance.com. I offer coaching consultations and also online personal training. Thank you guys for listening. I will take any questions you have.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and click the chat or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask Conor. Conor, I think one of the things I really like about you is that you go beyond the normal strength and conditioning kind of thing, especially talking about the breathing, which I don't think is talked about enough. And it's such an important, you really made me a true believer in regards to that, just talking about it, because if you follow Conor online, he's a great follow on Twitter as well as Instagram, lots of videos, lots of explanations, and things along that lines. And I just think it's really the subject is not talked about enough.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I think, unfortunately, well, the thing is, like, strength and conditioning is kind of still in its infancy. Like, we haven't really been along that, like research, like serious research began in like the late 20th century, like real hands-on serious research. So we really have been kind of figuring things out along the way. And I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to a lot of smart people who have showed me a lot of really cool things. And I can really tell you guys that this is where the industry is sort of starting to go, looking at things as a total body global approach, as opposed to just looking at muscles in isolation. Like, I want more core function. Well, then let me do a plank, and then that's it, right? So I think we need to think about how other structures affect ones that are further away. It's the idea, if you guys have ever heard proximal stability equals distal mobility, that just means your pelvis is going, if you're controlled in your pelvis, then mobility down the chain at your ankles is going to potentially be better because you have control of what's going on closer to your body.
And I think as an athlete, if you can concentrate on the things that you're talking about, number one, obviously will make you a better athlete and will certainly better your performance. And I don't think a lot of people are talking about it. So, which is certainly an advantage for the athletes. I know my daughter is getting ready to go to college next year, and, she wants to become a certified strength and conditioning coach.
Nice.
And stuff. So I'm really excited about the possibilities and the things that are coming along, the things that you're talking about, and that kind of things of where this is all going in the future. So really excited about that. So if you got a question for Conor, please feel free, hit the chat or hit the Q&A. Where can they find you on social media?
So you guys can find me at Conor_Harris. It's this right here. Oh, well, the underscore is there because it's underlined, but it's just CONOR, like Conor McGregor _Harris, HARRIS, and then another underscore after that.
And we'll make sure to tag Conor and all this that we put on social media on all of our platforms. One thing that you have that, you've been on our podcast before. Mm-hmm. You've got your own podcast. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about that and some of the recent subjects you've been talking about?
I do. It's called the Pinnacle Performance Podcast. You'll find it on my website right here. We talk about all sorts of different things. I have just a huge variety of guests on there. So if you guys are interested in performance, like I just had Bob Alejo on, who is extremely knowledgeable about ACL tears. And we talked about ACL tears for a good hour yesterday. And we get into details about athletics. We get into details about biomechanics. And I try to keep it, again, pretty conversational. We're not trying to get into too much detail where it's confusing for the average person who isn't, an expert in these things. So if you guys are interested in all things performance, I have just about every sort of field underneath the realm of strength and conditioning and fitness. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely check it out.
One of the things, too, that I like that you talk about a lot, and actually I think we had you on for a podcast just strictly about this, was hamstrings, which I know you're very passionate about and have some great observations and thoughts about that, too.
Absolutely. So if we is my screen still on?
Yeah.
Okay. If we're thinking about this picture right here, the anterior tilt, there's so much data out there that suggests hamstrings are so important for ACL prevention, for overall reduction of back, for knee, for ankle injuries. These hamstrings are so important because they're controlling our pelvis. And like I said, so many athletes are quad dominant that they become forced into this position a lot of the times because their pelvis, their hamstrings aren't being balanced out. They're not able to control all of this force that's going forward. So in order for us to be efficient athletes, in order for us to not have to compensate because of a lack of movement within our pelvis, then we need our hamstrings. And that's step one. There are other things that play into that, but ultimately, guys, if we just got our hamstrings to function properly, then we would see so many less injuries, so many less ACLs, so many less back injuries. So I think it's really important to understand the idea that if you don't have mobility where you need mobility, then you're going to find that mobility in a joint that's probably supposed to be stable, because the body alternates between mobility and stability throughout our joints. So our ankle's supposed to be mobile, our knee is supposed to be stable, our hip is supposed to be mobile, and our low back is supposed to be stable. So if we don't have mobility in our hips, then we might need to find that mobility at our knee. So if we can't find internal rotation, if our pelvis can't actually shift over our thigh bone, our femur, and we can't get that proper internal rotation, then that knee might collapse in, because that knee is trying to find the internal rotation that the pelvis does not have. And you guys are going to really struggle to find internal rotation if your pelvis is in this forward orientation.
If you have any questions for Conor, please feel free to hit the chat or Q&A button, and we'll get Conor to answer them before we kind of wrap things up. I asked this question of Erica Suter. She's in the same line with you, talking about, we had her on the webinar a couple of weeks ago, and just to kind of get your perspective on this, I know we didn't talk about it beforehand that I would ask you this, but I know that you're very opinionated about it, and I'm glad that you are. But obviously, with us in the situation that we're in right now, where there's a suspension in soccer, suspension in everything that we're doing now in society, we're getting a lot of things on social media of exercises and activities that you can do. What advice would you give to players and parents and coaches that are looking at this stuff, that you sit there? Because I saw a video of, was it you that put it on there, of what was it, Jamison Winston?
Yeah.
Who was doing that? Was he doing squats on balancing?
On a Bosu ball. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just like, I mean, somebody told him to do that. And I mean, what are your thoughts in regards to that kind of stuff about trying to filter out the garbage?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you guys. So because of the financial circumstances that we're in, even before that, trainers are looking for a way to stand out so that they can get clients through either online means or just kind of make a name for themselves. So when that happens, there's a tendency to push towards novelty, towards exercises that look sexy, that look really cool, but ultimately have no functional carryover. So you see all this stuff with Bosu balls. We don't play on a moving surface. Soccer takes place on the ground, which is very stable. So unless we're playing in an earthquake, I don't see the benefit of doing Bosu ball training. I just don't think that it's beneficial. So if you guys see things that look pretty cool, but they look a little crazy, that's probably an indication that exercise is not optimal. And it's probably just an attempt of that trainer to stand out and make a name for themselves. But I would say that, I'm sure Erica would say the same thing, that really the most important things you guys could be doing is sprinting, is keeping your speed high, would be just general exercises like push-ups, like good squats, split squats. And a lot of these exercises you can do without any equipment. So ultimately, I think it's just the basics. And I know that's a boring answer, but it's so true. Like if we don't have the basic fundamental principles down, especially as developing high school athletes, we don't need anything fancy. We don't need to be back squatting or front squatting twice our body weight. We just need to be developing good movement patterns, because that's what's going to carry over. We're in this stage of our life when we're in high school and early college, where we are hardwiring our brain towards certain movement patterns, and we're biasing ourselves towards a certain like states, orientations in our body that can be hard to get out of, especially as we get older. So ultimately just focus on the basics. Sprinting is the most important exercise pretty much any athlete can do anyway, and you don't need any equipment for it. So I think that's a really good thing to do.
Before we wrap things up, one more time, let people know where they can find you, your website, where they can find how to train with you, and how to find your podcast.
Absolutely. So everything is here at www.thepinnacleperformance.com. It should be pretty easy to navigate. And I have my podcast link on there. I have my online training, my contacts. And also, if you're a coach and you're interested in learning more about this, I also do one-on-one coaching consultations. And also, I will add that I am doing a group coaching consultation program. Early bird pricing ends tomorrow. So if you guys are interested in that, make sure to direct message me. We're going to have a bunch of coaches in there at a pretty cheap price. And I'm just going to present a lot of what I know about this sort of information, how we can maximize performance, looking at how an individual tends to be biased into certain orientations, breathing patterns, and then overall just getting them back to a neutral state where they have full movement variability to them, so they're not limited and potentially at risk for injury.
And coaches too, get in on that kind of thing, because the healthier you can keep your athlete, the more they're available to you. I had a coach tell me one time, "You're only as valuable to me as much as you're available to me."
Exactly.
Wonderful.
So true.
Well, Conor, certainly thank you for coming on the webinar today. We appreciate it, and hopefully people will reach out to you and contact you through your website or on social media if they have any questions. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Marcus.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for another WVSA Digital Network Series webinar. We'll be having a couple of more as we go on, so certainly check out our website, wvsoccer.net. Click on resources, click WV Digital Network Series, and you'll be able to find all that information there. And we'll talk to you next time. Take care.